Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Marketing in the Digital Frontier, Making Your Brand Stand Out. I am Alicia, and I will be your host for today. As we let people trickle in and we get things started, we want to get to know you a little bit better, so we're going to run a few polls. Let us share our first poll now. What is your industry? Are you an agency, business, or financial service, food and beverage, travel and tourism, retail, or other? We would have put more in, but we were capped at 5, so feel free to answer whatever best applies to you. Give about 20 seconds to let people answer. There's probably some technology companies on here too, but really excited to have a broad audience. Okay, about 5 more seconds. All right, it looks like we mostly have about 54% agency, business, and/or financial services, a couple retail, and a bunch of others. Welcome, everyone. Now, 3 more polls, and then we'll get things started. What is your role? Are you in marketing, production, creative, an account manager, or other? We'll give you about 30 seconds as people trickle in. All right, about 5 more seconds. Okay, looks like about half the audience is marketing, 36% creative, 8% production, an account manager, and other. All right, 2 more, and then I will pass it over to our speakers for today. Have you heard of Snapwire? Yes, no, who is Snapwire? I'll give you about 10 more seconds. Okay, looks like about 25% yes, 55% no, and 22% who is Snapwire. I think the question was supposed to be, do you currently use Snapwire? But it's all good. We get the idea. Chad can give a little insight into that. Next and last poll question, have you heard of Brandfolder? Yes, no, we currently use Brandfolder. All right, we'll give about 5 more seconds. Okay, it looks like about 36% yes, I've heard of Brandfolder, 42% no, and 22% we currently use Brandfolder. Welcome, everyone. And with that, I am going to pass it over to Chad and Lucia to take it over. Here you go,
Thanks,
Chad.
Alicia. All right. Well, thank you, Alicia. Nice to present to everybody here. I'm Chad Newell. I'm the founder and CEO of Snapwire. And Snapwire is a company that was founded in 2012. And what we are is we're a network marketplace that affords us to leverage 800,000 visual creators in 180 countries who are primarily scored and ranked based on their quality and specialties, and it affords brands and corporations to leverage our community and our platform to find real true efficiencies in the production of visual content. And the reason we exist is because, well, 8 years ago, technology democratized photography, and a surge of aspiring photographers and videographers flocked to an app called Instagram. And there they began to hashtag favorite brands that they wanted to be recognized by. And then soon after that, we recognized that there was a new social currency evolving, and that was likes and follows. And as they did this, brands started recognizing this. They started to take note, and then suddenly their volumes of content needs surged. We'll get into a little bit more about that later, but we find utility in an individual when a brand or an enterprise needs to leverage that talent. And what we can do is we can do location-based visual content at scale, where we can produce thousands upon thousands of photo briefs or visual creative briefs to all map to a style guide or a creative brief, and scale that out in remote regions. So if you needed the same visual content story arc told in Seattle, Washington, as you did in the Bronx in New York, our platform would afford you to do that. So that's what Snapwire does. Lucia?
Hi, everyone. I'm Lucia, and I'm thrilled to join Chad on this webinar today. I've been with Brandfolder for about 3 years as their creative director. And at Brandfolder, I oversee both design on the marketing team and the product team. Before coming to work in-house at Brandfolder, my background was doing creative work for agencies. So I've worked on branding for a huge variety of clients, and now I get to work on a platform that supports branding for some of the biggest companies in the world. So I'm looking forward to sharing a little bit more about how critical it is to establish a process that brings your visual content from creation to distribution, so your brand is able to stand out. But first, I'll hand it back over to Chad to explain a little bit about why we're here today.
Yeah, certainly interesting times. I won't unsay the word unprecedented, although I just said it. It's, everybody recognizes how difficult it is today for marketing teams and for brands to contextualize the importance of telling their story. But I tell you, and I think everybody knows this that's on this call, how important it is to maintain relevancy and to tell our visual stories and our written stories. Again, as I mentioned in my introduction, a few years ago, things changed dramatically very quickly, and brands were forced to tell a story on new social mediums that certainly most consumers were adopting very rapidly. So what was 4 content pieces a month became 4,000 content pieces a month, and we've heard the comment in that statement quoted from, I think it was a PepsiCo executive, but it's a really true thing. Because of that social media explosion, the volumes increased, and guess what? Most of us are spending a lot more time on social these days than ever before. So it's not a surprise why brands choose the one medium that can tell 1,000 worlds, and they've been doing that forever. But visual content can tell that story, and its relevancy is in demand more than ever. There's not a lot of places right now for marketing to take place, the traditional marketing. But what we do know is that our audiences are spending a lot more time on social. So it's super important for brands to be utilizing this opportunity to be producing visual content. And it's my belief that there are ways and affordable ways in which we can produce that visual content without leveraging the expense associated with traditional methods. Obviously relying on unique ways to tell stories, leveraging our networks is one of those methods, but also leveraging efficiency platforms is also another way. Digitally is officially the most critical method of marketing. Digital content is officially the most critical way to do this storytelling, and so we have to have a presence. And there's a huge component of the digital methodology in the visual side of things. So producing that at scale is something that's going to be critical, and brands certainly need to be increasing their footprint today. So that's one of the reasons why we're here, is to take an observation of the opportunity and to also recognize the importance of a larger footprint during this time. So Lucia, what do you think why we're here?
Yeah, so kind of to mirror a little bit about what you just mentioned, what does this mean for marketers and creatives? Well, what we've noticed at Brandfolder is massive growth in the amount of visual assets that brands are creating. And this is both in the quantity, but also the types and formats of assets. And I think there's a lot of reasons for this. I think, one, brands are feeling the pressure to stay fresh and evolve their image and visual identity to match the changing needs and expectations of their consumers. But 2, I think brands are seeing the power of personalization. Visual brand assets are never a one-size-fits-all, and you don't want to risk isolating a group of potential consumers because you overlooked them when creating your brand materials. It's 2020, and we are bombarded with ads and influencers and products every single second. So consumers have gotten really good at identifying the brands that they connect with and the ones that they don't. So because of this, we've seen that companies are placing huge value on their brand assets, and it's the job of creatives and marketers to ensure that value is being seen and realized and isn't being wasted. People in these roles are also spending so much time and money creating beautiful content now. And especially with everything that's going on, it's so important that your creative digital content is being used and it's being amplified. And later on, I'll explain a little more about how you can successfully manage the life cycle of these assets using a brand platform. But I'll pass it back over to Chad, and he can share a little bit more on the importance of digital branding during these times.
Yeah, thanks. What is digital branding? I think it's a question that even as a founder of a company, when we first started our journey way back in 2012, we had a hard time identifying what we wanted our brand to be. And it's it's kind of a funny thing, but it's simply put, your brand is your genetic code to your brand's cell structure, right? So once you invest in its identity, you create a path for mitosis where eventually your customer starts to recognize you. And as those cells sort of divide, it starts to take shape. And that's why repetitive exposure is so critical. The more they see you, and if done correctly, the more they remember you and your products and or service. So the next time that your brand attributes to a customer's needs, I think that you've successfully started to create shape, an embodiment of a brand. Your brand tells your customer what they can expect from you and your products and your services, and it differentiates you from your competitors. And I think it's important to remember that your brand is derived from who you are and who you want to be, and it just as equally as how people perceive you to be. And so when we think about the journey to brand identity and the path to building out a strong brand, next slide, Alicia. You kind of land on how to kind of identify you. But it's important to recognize the journey to identifying a brand. You have to really intimately know your customer. And so it's important to, just like when we create creative briefs here at Snapwire, it is critical for us to identify who the persona is. Who's the end user of the product or service? How does the product or service relate to them? Absolutely critical. You're charged to building trust with your customer. And obviously the whole exercise of branding itself is to expand your audience. But again, you're trying to make connections for your story so that your audience expands, and when your audience does expand, they remember your brand. You have to lead forward with strength and as a leader, but you have to make sure that the brand is supported by a long-term marketing strategy. More than anything, it will give your business the chance to enhance and reach the different channels when you develop and maintain a brand, but it's going to allow you to become more deliberate with your marketing while standing out from your competitors. One of the things to sort of re-echo here is making sure that the journey of brand identity includes persona documentation. And we at Snapwire have gone through the exercise of really identifying who in our ideal customer profile, who those people are, what their titles are. And you might have heard, in marketers here on the call might have heard of a strategy that's been sort of coined in the last, let's say, 2 or 3 years, called account-based marketing, account-based selling. It's been practiced in theory, in reality for decades, but the very activity of deeply understanding who your ideal customer profile is and what they like, what they don't like, what they do on the weekends, what sort of things they follow, what articles are written about that brand or that your customer, is a critical step into mapping out all the value connections that you and your service or your product will connect to. And when you map out a persona document and you're identifying who is the persona for your company, you really start to see how you can shape your brand, because remember, you're trying to keep those connections going. Next slide. in creating themes for or thinking about reflecting on themes for making a brand digitally successful, we have to create a story, and that narrative that we use um, is not only to help the brand story, but what we're trying to achieve through their vision and goals. We do this often with written words and visual content, but we definitely need to exceed the client's expectations when we're developing a brand. Next slide. In brand identity, when you're trying to create content that is actually about the customer experience, you're telling a story. And I think this is where, in my entire career, I started out when I was, in my 20s, and I'm now damn near 50. But, I've been in visual content, looking at visual images and mapping those visual images to somebody's story all my life. Started out in stock photography, working at a company called the Image Bank, moved to Getty Images. But seeing visual content support the story arc of a brand is something that it sometimes is a blank canvas for many people that are now been recently charged to go and figure out what that brand story needs to look like. They've often relied on an agency to do that, and now in today's environment, they're being forced to do this on their own. Where do you start? You start with discipline, and you start with the creative brief. Creative briefs are a critical piece for any project, but they're certainly the beginning structure for a journey when you're trying to create the brand visual identity. It's all about the customer's experience and the people that enjoy those products, and it needs to be community-centric. The partnership, you got to be thinking about this, it's a partnership between you and your client, and it's not always about you. You got to be thinking about the customer. But one way to do this is with free resources like videos, webinars, blog posts, and ebooks, and content just like this. But it should always contain a good visual reminder and the ability to tell stories between what your brand needs to be reaching toward, and that's your ideal customer profile. We're looking at some of the examples that we've used to produce some of this content here right now in the past for other brands and businesses. But it's important to ultimately these are assets to drive conversion, and it needs to look good, sharp, and include the story. So how do these elements bring us to life? Well, it's about content. It's got it. You have to have written content. The visual content piece is just as critical, but it does start with written. And oftentimes in production cycles, we are supporting visual assets against written content, and other times visual content is demanding written content support. But when we come up with the ideal customer profile based on the personas, in which we absolutely, and you should as well, ensure that you have a good handle on, then the story arc can be written against that. And visual and written content live hand in hand. We know with certainty that when written content has visual content assets supporting it, engagement drives up toward 90%, and on an ad, it drives a conversion rate of higher of 30%. So it's super critical, and the visual pieces of it have to be through design, obviously, is an option, photography and video. It's without question, video is more engaging. But Marketing Sherpa states that video content attracts 300% more traffic than still content alone or just written content. Although all content is powerful, high quality visual content is absolutely critical, and it can be the most impactful piece of the part of the content when it exists in all the digital channels, because it makes you stand out. So, my advice is to be looking for a technology, a partner or a partner of yours, whether it be an agency or your roster of creators, who can help facilitate this content and manage it in a way that gives visibility to everybody in the organization, but visibility to your customers, no matter if you're working in-house production or with a team of outside freelancers, or even your agency. Make sure that you're having a framework to facilitate the workflows associated with the visual content and the written content. flows. It's really difficult to scale visual content when you're living in a spreadsheet. Eventually, a brand or an enterprise has to leap out of spreadsheets and get into a project management foundation to manage visual asset production. Yeah, so establishing, you know, a concrete brand identity that is recognizable is one of the biggest attributes of determining what the visual content strategy should be. It's important to recognize that the identity maps back to these ICPs, and you have to differentiate yourself from others in the space clearly. So we've all heard the adage that, you know, stock photography, maybe you haven't, but it's sort of the red-headed stepchild of the visual content space. And we often see brands make that fatal mistake of using the same asset as their competitors. Especially, this happens a lot in the financial in the financial vertical. And you know, it's no surprise probably that Snapwire services a lot of financial institutions who want to create unique content. That content in stock archives is relatively limiting. And Snapwire affords brands to sort of produce that unique content that their competitors doesn't have. But it also affords, you know, another trend that's happening where visual storytelling needs to happen at a localized level. We need to know that the intimate neighborhood of a city that our brand or our service is actually penetrating is related and relatable to other audience members that know those spaces intimately. So we're seeing a surge in neighborhood storytelling where we have to have that documentation well captured. And, you know, we have to personalize the buyer's journey for the brand experiences. And when we do that, we're often coming up with a custom solution visually. We're handcrafting the visual identity inside of an image to do that. Anyway, this is to make sure that we engage our audiences and ensure that the digital marketing channels are supported with the visual content that can support that. Obviously we know where visual content is going to be used. It's within all the anecdotal and sort of obvious channels, but some are more important today than ever. And while it's expensive to produce display ads and banner ads right now, and perhaps even virtual events, there is this opportunity for organic social, paid social, organic social. I want to underscore that right now. I see, as a sort of visual domain expert, I see a ton of brands missing an opportunity right now, not being more present inside of social channels. There are easy hacks to create narratives for which you resonate with your audiences right now with the visual assets that you have in your archives. Whether or not it's easily accessible, it's content that your team is producing with your own abilities. You have this unique opportunity to help your brand be remembered and drive connections. And so I'm seeing a lack of engagement, most undoubtedly because marketing teams are being forced to sort of become quiet during this time through reductions. But there is this opportunity for those brands that choose to invest in social, organic social specifically, to be filling out their feeds more aggressively. Next slide. Yeah, so quality is an important piece to all of this. We want to make sure that it's simple content, rules of third, lots of negative space. Our visual cortex have been retrained thanks to the birth of social media. When we're scrolling on our feed, we want to make sure that we're pausing, we're stopping. We don't do that with cluttered assets. We typically do that with curated, beautiful assets that have been produced. A full bleed image with minimal text on it is one way to make sure that we ensure connection and engagement. Keeping it fresh, obviously, is a strategy in which most marketers and creative individuals want to actually yield from their asset to production. What does that mean? It means a lot of things to a lot of different people, but it's about volumes, creating a library, getting the buy-in for an investment of a small asset library for the next 30, 60, 90 days is a critical step, I think, to making an impact. And those fresh assets can be done really economically. You can do that through the mobile devices that we have in our pockets, of course, and you can do that through a little bit of proper content planning. But come up with a strategy where your content is fresh and constantly in the feeds, and that means that you're doing it often. Keeping it visual. Again, I'm a big believer of it. Obviously, it's self-interest, but I'm a big believer that we're spending a lot of time on visual platforms like Instagram right now, and so let's invest in visual assets today. So with that, that's my spiel. I'll pass it over to Lucia, and what's your intake on visual brand?
Thanks, Chad. Okay, so to follow up, you've spent at this point an enormous amount of time and money and care to create your brand assets. So now you have your visual identity. All that effort is rendered useless if you don't have a proper method in place to move your assets from creation into market and actually make sure they're being shared and being used and being seen. So now what do you do? For my portion, I'm going to walk through the steps we at Brandfolder use to create and publish this piece of content. And I'll give you some tips and tricks and some important things to consider. So as you can see, this is an Instagram ad, and this is an ad for a tool of ours called templating. Just to give some context on the thinking behind this ad, the Brandfolder templating tool allows users to edit text and imagery straight from the platform. So you don't need to download or pay for expensive design programs like the Adobe Suite. So the premise of the ad is that this tool makes everyone feel like a designer, even when they're not one. So what I want to do is I want to walk through what we call the life cycle of a brand asset or a creative asset, which is the process of moving an asset through the phases of creation into a method for storing it, editing and manipulating it, and then eventually publishing it. So the first step or tip is what I just mentioned. Beyond cloud storage, your brand needs a platform that can manage the entire life cycle of your visual content. So what does this mean? For one, you have to stay organized. We've seen two storage solutions that people commonly use that are so ineffective, mainly because they really silo access to one person or one small group of people. So one of those ineffective solutions is on-premise. So that would be if a designer or anyone really was keeping all their files on their desktop or they're on their computers, which would render them inaccessible to other users. You know, COVID is a really good example of how ineffective on-premise solutions are. Almost everyone has gone remote at the moment. And if people in your organization have their files stored locally on their computers and desktops, then nobody has access to them. And on-premise solutions are also really, or they can get really expensive. As I mentioned earlier, I used to work in an agency for a really long time, and we would work with tons of clients on their brand and website and mobile and desktop apps. And I can't tell you how difficult it was to retrieve brand assets from them. I used to literally have people sitting at my desk all day long transferring hundreds of raw files from a USB drive. And we were at the time charging them, you know, really high flat hourly rate. So their lack of accessible and organized files really became a really expensive problem. The second ineffective solution is just simple cloud storage like Google Drive or Dropbox. This one's pretty standard in most organizations. It's messy, it's chaotic, different users have access to different things, different users have different organization structures that might make sense to only them. Assets can get duplicated multiple times over and buried in confusing folder structures. You know, maybe I know the folder structure for what I'm looking for, but the designer next to me doesn't know it. So I've actually, you know, in the past been guilty of this many times. And then on top of that, it's really ineffective if your organization has employee turnover, which is obviously something that happens at every job. So this brings us to how digital asset management as a platform is much more effective as a solution for storage and organization. So say we hired Snapwire to do a photo shoot of cool, hipster seniors with tattoos and pink hair, just giving them a really over-exaggerated look that plays off of what you would see with a stereotypical designer. And then from this photo shoot, we've created hundreds of raw files, which are huge in size, and they're packed with tons of metadata. And I know that for this particular ad, we'll want people on both the creative team and the marketing team to collaborate before we're comfortable publishing it. So it's so important for assets like these to not be siloed by one person or one part of a department. Having a company-wide and company-accepted method of organization or storage is step one towards creating any successful visual content. So as you can see for our scenario, we have this asset library for all the photos. There's over 1,400 images in this particular library. So it's crucial for teams to have a way to find the exact photos they need really quickly. And for us, when we're working with our brand content, we rely heavily on tags that have been assigned to our assets, as well as what we call custom fields, which is a key to value relationship. So as you can see below this image of Susan, we have values for things like the campaign that it's for, the name of the model, the social channel we plan on using it for, which is Instagram in this case. I can just search the word glasses or pink, and then this image would show up. So these are all things you can really easily search on. So whatever method you choose to use, we stress the importance of organization because 65% of assets go unused and are essentially wasted. We use this Forrester stat a lot because it really shows how much value is being lost in visual assets, and we attribute this loss of value to poor organization. Okay, so the next step would be to establish a process and workflow. So each asset carries its own value and has its own story. So as you can see from some of these ads of ours, they're selling different features. They might have a slightly different audience. We don't use them for the same channels. They belong to two completely different campaigns. So the image of the pug is part of one we use to market some general features of our product. In this case, our data and analytics. And we chose, an adorable dog for this campaign because they're universally cute and eye-catching, and everyone loves them. And the other two are obviously part of our templating campaign that also featured Susan. And they differ in the fact that they're contradictory and they're a little bit ridiculous and are part of that message that templating makes everyone feel like a designer. So all these ads had to start with moving photos out of storage at one point and into a process that involved several members on our marketing team working together. And this workflow process included steps like selecting the images, deciding on the copy, deciding where they should be used, deciding when they'll be used, and if they have rights that will expire at some point. Maybe they have to expire at some point because the rights are going to run out. Ensuring the messaging and the visuals are on brand, and then approving these assets once the design team is done working with them. So every organization does this a little bit differently. So however you choose to do this, just make sure you have some established process in place and make sure you're constantly improving on this process so it's efficient. At Brandfolder, we're really proud to be a central source of truth for this type of content. So internally, we run through all these steps from our platform, and we have methods for bookmarking and favoriting, commenting and annotating on assets. We have methods for classifying them, as I mentioned earlier. We can assign approvals to those people and members on the leadership team who have to have eyeballs on everything before it goes out. And then we also can set these ads to have publish dates and expiration dates. So having a single place from which to do all of this has sped up the time it takes us to move a design into distribution. It creates total transparency for all team members to see how this image got from point A to point B. And it's made it much easier to onboard new team members to the process when they start. Okay, so tip number 2 is to empower your stakeholders and team members to distribute your brand's visual content with confidence. Okay, so by now you've established where everything lives. You've moved through the process of deciding which assets have been approved for certain campaigns, and now you need to get them out there. They're nothing if they're just sitting in storage. So the way to do this is by trusting people outside of a designer role or a marketing role to share your visual content. As a creative myself, I know that this is a scary thought, although, well, you know, the scary thought is allowing non-creative people to have access to my assets, but bear with me. Creatives and marketers waste approximately 10 hours a week responding to asset requests. This is a statistic we've gathered from interviewing many clients, but I fully understand the struggle, and I agree with this as an average number. As a designer, you really value the uninterrupted time that you're heads down, you're focusing on your creative work, and then someone on the sales team starts asking me to change the format of something or to compress something or crop something. This is time that I can't get back. And it's really easy to remove the middleman in this scenario if you have a good process in place. So the way to do this is to make sure you've enabled team members to find what they're looking for, to edit or manipulate it for the purposes they need it for, and to share it confidently, knowing they aren't going off brand or they're not using an asset they shouldn't be using. This is especially critical right now because there's more pressure on designers and marketers to turn over visual assets quicker than ever. Designers are trying to keep up with trends, marketers need to ship faster, and things like COVID happen, and every brand is changing their messaging because of it. And because of this, we're seeing what we call the shelf life of an asset is getting shorter and shorter. So to facilitate fast turnaround in visual content, we're seeing creatives less protective of their assets, just knowing that there are permissions in place. So they can be a little bit more flexible because at the end of the day, everyone in the organization is an ambassador to the brand in some degree. So what does this look like from a technical perspective? Well, some tools that can help team members manipulate and share things could be allowing them to find and change the sizes and formats of assets themselves. Maybe they can crop assets themselves, like you can see from the screenshot here. Having presets in place so you know people will still maintain the asset's integrity is really important. So our templating tool from this ad does just that. It empowers people to be creative within reasonable boundaries. And all this helps free up time and resources. Another pro tip is that find out what tools your team members are using and make sure those tools talk to wherever your assets are stored. It's so annoying to have to download and re-upload just so you can share things. You want to take advantage of integrations as much as you can. Integrations are so helpful because they ensure that you have the most recent content. They prevent you from filling up space on your drive. And then if used efficiently, you could end downloads forever. So the last step, the last tip is to gather qualitative and quantitative feedback. So you want to leverage the insights and feedback you're getting from the assets and content you're currently promoting in market and use that feedback to inform future visual content. So what are some ways you can establish this necessary feedback loop? Document the workflow interactions. I mentioned this one earlier. It's really beneficial to have the entire creation process in one place so you can reference it later. Another one that sounds like a pain, but is so helpful at the end of the day is to establish recurring meetings. Every Monday morning, I meet with our marketing team and we discuss what ads or content are succeeding, which ones are failing, and they're able to provide statistics from a few different sources, one of them being Brandfolder. And regardless of my bias towards my creative work, their information is always backed up by data, and it helps me to inform future designs. I know, like most creatives, I can get a little bit attached to work that I think is good. But if the market feedback is saying it's not good, then I've just got to deal with it. So this is a good way to not feel like you're totally married to your work. The third tip is to embrace digital feedback and activity. Our marketing team is always responding to comments and questions that people will leave on Facebook and on Instagram and on LinkedIn. And these insights from non-users or non-clients are always really interesting. I know that recently we ran a campaign that had an image of a USB drive, or like a little USB drive on it, with a tagline that said, "Just say no." And tons of people commented asking if it was an anti-vaping ad or, or an anti-Juul ad. So we learned very, very quickly that that ad concept wouldn't work for today's market, and we had to revise it. And then the last way to establish a feedback loop is to use trackable distribution methods. And better yet, have a plan in place in case you publish something that you need to revise really quickly. So one way to do this successfully would be to use an embed code wherever you post stuff, instead of uploading a single file every time you need to upload an asset. At least if you have, at least when an asset is embedded, it means that you can usually edit it or replace it in the original location, and it should update everywhere that embed code has been used. So we use something like this for the images on our website, for our Marketo ads, and it's something called CDN, which stands for Content Delivery Network. And it's prevented so many potential headaches where we've accidentally published things that have typos. It happens. We've used incorrect imagery. We've posted an image that maybe has our rights to it have expired. So we're able to replace those things right away really quickly. So at the end of the day, it's really important to embrace data because it can greatly improve your creative workflow. Okay, so to wrap up, I've been working as a creative for a really long time now. And like lots of people in my shoes, I've used processes that were bad. They wasted my time. They wasted company money. And through trial and error, I found great ones that work for me. But regardless of how your team chooses to move creative work into distribution, we've found that having everything in one place has been a huge benefit to us and our clients. At Brandfolder, we have thousands of brands that use us as their DAM platform, including tons of enterprise and Fortune 500 companies, and they all attest that having a DAM platform as a backbone is vital in 2020, especially when everything is almost hyper digital, in the sense that the turnover in content is so fast, as I was mentioning and Chad was mentioning earlier. The quality is getting so good. The competition is so fierce right now. And on top of it, you never know when everyone in the world is suddenly going to go remote. We are now. So you need to stay in control, stay on brand, have complete insight into how your brand and marketing assets are being used, ensure they're being used correctly, and how they're performing once they're published and public. So with that, I can pass the mic, I guess, back to Alicia if we want to do a little Q&A session.
Gia and Chad, wanted to remind everyone that this is being recorded. So an on-demand recording will be sent to your inbox after the event wraps up. Also, if you, I believe all of you have my email address because it was part of the invite cadence. So feel free to send me an email if you want to have more immediate access to the recording or you can't find it. Again, thank you so much, Lucia and Chad. So if you have any questions, please send it into the chat box. We have a little bit of time and a couple questions already. And if not, we'll give people a couple minutes back in their day. To get things started, I'm going to ask you a question, Lucia. Lucia, you make it sound like you can design and create straight from your platform, but I heard you mention Photoshop. So how does that part of the creative process work? You're on mute, Lucia.
Oop, Lucia.
Are not designed to design within. So I work on both, as I mentioned, the marketing team and the product team on design work. And on both sides of the aisle, we leverage integrations all day long. So on the product side, I do all my design work in Sketch. And it was so important for us to have a Sketch integration that can access all the files and all the assets in the DAM, but also a Sketch integration that's able to sync back into Brandfolder. So as I'm working, I know I'm not losing anything. And this is also a way for our engineering team and our development team to have access to my most recent Sketch files all the time. It also really helped that I was able to work with our integration team on creating that and like letting them know how designers are using Sketch and how it would work really well with a cloud storage solution like a DAM. And then on the marketing side, we use the Adobe Creative Suite for everything, mostly Photoshop and Illustrator. So whenever I'm working in Photoshop, we have a plugin for Brandfolder. I just turn it on. And I know that as I'm working, everything is getting synced back into Brandfolder. So those are a couple ways I make sure when I'm designing, I'm not losing anything. And again, everybody kind of has access to those files. Of course, with everything that we do, we have permissions in place. So, I'm not allowing the finance department to access my Sketch files and edit or destroy anything in there. But as long as you are organized and you kind of have permissions set by maybe a person or a department, you can integrate with almost all design tools. And so, yeah, that's how we use it in our workflow every single day.
Hey, Lucia, I had you had mentioned something about discovery in Brandfolder, and it kind of, I wanted to know a little bit about how it works there. Sometimes a customer of ours, oftentimes a delivery platform like Uber, will come to us and say, hey, we'd like you to capture a neighborhood or points of interest. And important for us that you embed into the IPTC header of the photography tags, keywords, certain specific things, ownership of rights, even it's simply for SEO benefits, right? Because the brand or the enterprise has an agenda, and that's perhaps to do a city guide or launch some sort of a larger agenda for SEO and SEM objectives. And interestingly enough, they invest that data in the production cycle of the assets. It's a directive. It's important, even down to the geolocation, right? Because that's how Google will see that as being true and authentic. Is that how is that pulled from assets in Brandfolder, and how is it discovered? Is it simply a traverse from in a field to tags?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So something that I didn't even realize until I started working there is how much metadata is inside every single asset. If you had like an image on your desktop and you hit the show info button, it would give you a couple like basic metadata information, like maybe the camera that it was shot on, or who shot it, and the sizes obviously, and the dimensions and the format and stuff like that. But once I've got to say, I don't know, I would have to ask our engineering team, but once you upload an asset into Brandfolder, you can go into that asset and it is hundreds of lines of metadata, and all of that information is searchable.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, so if you were, at Snapwire to do a photo shoot, come here to Denver, and then come to our office and do a photo shoot, that geolocation, I mean, you wouldn't even have to put that information in there. It's just built in the metadata. If you uploaded a bunch of images from a photo shoot in there and then you search Denver, all of the images from that photo shoot would show up, and you wouldn't even have to type in Denver anywhere. I mean, there's a lot, there's tons of data, and yeah, you can search on all of it, and you can add your own as well. So that's what we do a lot to classify things.
Question for you, Chad. You talked about obviously content and how that's really what you can use for digital marketing channels, but really how you establish your brand online and both in more traditional ways. What are certain ways that people can actually start accessing visual content? I know some people are fortunate enough to have in-house teams that can work on that, but what are some other methods and means that people can leverage to get photos, videos, etc.?
Well, I think we sort of see two or three trends happening, and it's not too dissimilar to what you might imagine if you were tasked to do it yourself, is that you either rely on a short list or a short roster of friends or trusted creators to go produce assets. Two, you rely on your agency to go produce those assets. Or three, you compromise and you either don't produce those assets or you literally bring out your own cell phone and start creating those assets yourself. Every single one of those scenarios has a benefit and a cost associated with doing them. What we're seeing is a trend line where and it's indicative of the times, and it's indicative of the volume demand of the visual assets that are required and to stay relevant and to tell your story, is that a brand or an enterprise can rely on an agency at a pretty well-determined price point that's going to be larger than if they could do it themselves. And because agencies are traditionally expensive, a lot of these brands and enterprises are being forced to produce that content in-house, and that then illuminates a problem that you just touched on, which is I don't have a production team to go do this. Well, the reason why Snapwire is growing right now is in this era of the demand for more volumes of visual content with less budgets. Certainly the budgets were fixed, but now there's even less budgets to go do that. But the demand for the visual content in these channels is still growing, and perhaps you could argue needed more than ever. So they turn to a platform like Snapwire to get that production asset produced at scale and on budget and at a price point that they can afford, that is not too much more than a stock photo asset. So I think and maintains a much higher quality than a stock photo asset. So I think what you're seeing is that those three methods, right? Either you rely on your agency, you do it yourself because you have a roster of creators that you trust, or when volumes are required, you're going to need to rely on a service like Snapwire.
Time for a couple more questions. This one is for you, Lucia. Do you have any insights into what trends other creatives are implementing?
Yeah, so I love this. I'm able to see in Brandfolder how trends are evolving for our clients. One trend that's been growing for a couple of years now, but I've really loved seeing show up now, especially during COVID, is how brands are becoming more and more dynamic. So being able to alter your brand materials or alter your logo based on events that might be happening right now. Obviously, coronavirus is the big one that's happening. So I know for some of our clients, they've changed their logos to reflect social distancing measures. So, MasterCard is one of our clients, and we've seen them take the red circle and the yellow circle and then separate them. And it's cool. Even more exciting. Oh, I love these trends. And it's even more exciting because they're able to kind of update that logo everywhere, again, using the CDN that I mentioned earlier. So if they replace the logo in wherever their dam is, then that will update in other places. Another trend that I'm seeing is, or with our clients, is a rise in video and GIF material, and then just kind of assets with a lot more movement in general. I think this is because, we did a brand index report last year where we did kind of our take on trends in the way that people are using their assets and how they're changing. And I think because there are so many different channels that people are sharing their assets to right now, they're aware that users are getting tired of static ads. If you were on Instagram right now and you're scrolling through your feed, a year ago, most of those ads might be static, but now it would be almost strange if they're not video or having some kind of like movement in them. So we've seen a lot of clients uploading a lot more video into their brand folders. And then the last trend, or one large trend that I've seen lately, is a greater focus on branding for B2B companies. Typically, B2C are the ones that have, really creative ideas for branding and stuff. Those are going to be your retail companies, or your, I don't know, it's kind of obviously your consumer-based companies. But I feel like now B2B companies are trying to capture a younger and fresher audience, and also talent. The way that you brand yourself is a great way to attract talent. And I think they're trying to attract talent by showing that they're fresh and that they're fun and that they're not trying to kind of have the typical kind of boring brand that B2B companies have had in the last decade. I don't want to say that so badly, but I know that, Brandfolder, we're a B2B company, and we're trying to make a huge effort to show that, we're watching trends, we're dynamic, we really enjoy what we're seeing. We kind of want to mimic and show that we are creative. So I would say, yeah, a lot more B2B and a lot more kind of like SaaS and software companies are paying a lot more attention to creative branding right now. That answers
Thanks,
your
Lucia.
question.
There are two more questions that are really specific to Brandfolder. I don't know if you could kind of quickly go into those or not. Like, for instance, do you keep in progress work on Brandfolder, or how do you structure that within your company Brandfolder?
Oh, yeah, sure. Okay, I'm not muted, still good. I do keep in progress work on Brandfolder, at least when it comes to, or our designers do, when it comes to marketing design and when it comes to product design. We will have very kind of specific areas in Brandfolder where we say, this is work in progress. And at least in the way that I work with our developers, I can let them know, I'll check and see, where we're at with the kind of like revision history of an asset. But I can say, this is the most recent. The last time I synced this back into Brandfolder was yesterday, which means this feature that I was working on yesterday morning should be in there. So we do a lot of work in progress with Brandfolder. Also, what you can do that we've also done in the past is if we have a project management tool like Asana or Trello or Jira or something like that, if we're doing a lot of back and forth between team members in there, what we'll do is we'll just have a link to the asset in there. And so everybody can kind of reference what we're talking about. And then they can go back and then they can see, like I've uploaded because of like our revision history. And so you can have one asset, but then see all these previous versions that you had. And so this is a way that we can kind of manage back and forth in a workflow, also leveraging a task management tool like Asana. So it's good to just have kind of like a reference in place. So if anybody wants to ask a little bit more specifically, I'm on LinkedIn or, I'm always talking to clients of ours at Brandfolder. So I would love to kind of go over that stuff. But we've seen clients use really creative methods to integrating Brandfolder into their workflow, even if it doesn't literally use an integration. So there's a lot of great ways to do it, but we've seen a lot of different clients do it.
Are almost out of time. Just wanted to say thank you so much to Lucia and Chad. Thank you for everyone who joined us today. We really appreciate it. Also, thank you for the feedback so far. We definitely appreciate that. Like I mentioned, the recording will be sent out, so everyone will have access to watch this at their leisure or whenever they have a chance. They can also share it too. Hope that everyone joins us next time. And again, a special thank you to Chad and Lucia for today's presentation.
Bet. I just want to remind everybody that one of my questions was how do you produce when you don't have a team in place? We have a helpful ebook that you can download here in the webinar format that gives you some ideas on how to produce high quality visual content on a budget. So feel free to download that.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Okay, thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.